In the month of June this year, the Jammu and Kashmir administration came out with a new media policy. The policy has been highly criticized by journalists and media houses from the region. Among the many objectives stated in the policy are thwarting of misinformation and controlling fake news. The policy is highly controversial because it effectively lays down a mechanism to control media houses and journalists from the region. It empowers the government authorities to decide what is fake news, to verify background and antecedents of media houses and journalists. In the last year, many journalists from the region have suffered physical attacks, arbitrary arrests, criminal cases against them. In this context, the policy seems to make the position of journalists more vulnerable. To understand how this media policy will affect press freedom in Kashmir, we have with us today senior journalist and activist Geeta Seshu. Hi Geeta. Geeta is also the co-founder of Free Speech Collective and has been documenting cases of free speech violation and press freedom for many years now. So let's begin with the first part of our conversation. Uh, Geeta, you visited Kashmir last year around this time to document how the internet ban is affecting journalists and the media and the civil society generally. And you also published a report after your visit. So, how do you see this whole year of communication blockade, and then subsequently uh, 2G was restored? But how has it affected the the media?
I think the situation has worse from the time we went there, exactly actually a year ago when we released our report. From August 4th of last year, just the day before just before the communication blockade and the abrogation of Article 370, the internet had shut down in Kashmir. And this was perhaps the first time when it was so severe because all kinds of communication had completely been shut down. So, no broadband communication, no landlines, nothing. So, people had absolutely no information. It was a complete black hole in terms of information and just communication with one another, even for people who wanted to speak to their neighbors or family members, or so leave alone journalists and leave alone the media people who were really groping in the dark for the first few months. Now things slowly improved in the sense that journalists started coming out. There was a media center which the government set up, uh, primarily because journalists were coming from outside Kashmir, outside the valley. So really to help them, the media center was set up, and then of course journalists from Kashmir took it on. And there are lots of reports of the initial days, the fact that the journalists had to smuggle out pen drives where they had recorded their stories to outside Kashmir, outside the valley, so that it could get out. So the stories were getting out in that way. Now, what we saw is so there was a lot of this kind of a struggle. Subsequently, of course, there were these court cases, and there was hardly any relief in terms of the court hearings. To all the internet and the campaign of this worked really. There is 2G now, but the situation has got worse. And the reason why it got worse is that despite the 2G, there is very, very low bandwidth, low broadband, and journalists find it extremely difficult to send large files or photos or anything like that, which requires speed also. So there is a lot of that problem, which is faced by everyone, not just the journalists, all citizens, including healthcare workers who really needed it for COVID, who needed basic information. Doctors needed information on how to combat this thing, this virus, and they still didn't get it. So even when doctors petitioned, asking for the restoration of internet, they were not given this.
So, Geeta, let's move our discussion towards how media has been threatened. Would you like to tell us how this new policy is going to affect journalists and the media in Kashmir?
Journalists had been targeted by the administration for anything that seemed like that they were stepping out of line. So we've had journalists having cases filed against them. Journalists have been interrogated, questioned. UAPA has been charged for journalists from, photojournalists because of their Facebook posts. Uh, all of this has also been happening. Now, so there's this intimidation. Then the government came out with this media policy, which actually says that any anti national posts or anything that is anti national, or the journalists need to be accredited, they need to be verified before even the journalists who are working in the publication have to be verified before the publication gets its empanelment, is empaneled for government advertising. Government advertising is important because it's the one big source of revenue for the media. So, in the absence of any other economic businesses and the economy being in complete shutdown, government revenue becomes very important. So the government obviously uses that in this entire carrot and stick manner. Now, what I want to say is that the situation has not been new for people for the journalists especially and for the media. Uh, from the killing of Shujat Bukhari and the multiple cases of harassment, pellet injury, cases of journalists who've gone to cover some conflict that has broken out or encounter killings, the kind of managing of the narrative in a conflict zone which has seen conflict for the last 70 odd years. This is an old problem. It's got worse, it's got much, much worse because of the way the stranglehold on communication. Um, Today, Kashmir is no longer a prominent story in the media map.
Sorry to interrupt, Geeta, but do you think that this policy was not spoken about enough in the mainstream media outside Kashmir? Do you think it should have been taken up a policy which is as alarming as this one? Do you think it should have been spoken about uh, in the or addressed by the media here?
Question of a policy on advertising has always been an issue with the media in Kashmir. We've had the Kashmir Times, which is a leading newspaper and a very respected newspaper, which has been blacklisted by the authorities for several years now, and banned from getting government advertising. Now, the Kashmir Times actually petitioned the Press Council of India when this happened first, and the case just languished, and the Press Council of India did not do anything. It didn't get any kind of relief. There were other newspapers also which were blacklisted in this way. And invariably, the newspapers are not really told why they're being blacklisted. And they get to know that they're being blacklisted because of certain dissenting reports or so called anti India reports or anti national security reports and things like that. Nothing is really stated. So there is no forum that one can go and complain to. This is the situation of the media in Kashmir, the independent, dissenting, contrarian media in Kashmir, the media that does not accept the government's narrative all the time. Now, has the media in other parts of India or in outside of the Kashmir Valley shown any kind of solidarity towards towards other media houses that are facing this? No, unfortunately not. Have they even realized that what happens in Kashmir is like a laboratory to what will happen to them? I don't think they have bothered. And last year, if you recall, in 2019, just before the Lok Sabha elections, the run up to the Lok Sabha elections, leading newspapers in Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai the Hindu, the Times of India, and all these, were facing a lot of trouble with getting advertising from the government, because that was around the time that the Rafael deal was being questioned a lot. And I'm told that even the Hindu still struggles to get advertising. So it's not like this happens only here, but the fact that there is no one here to speak up for the media in Kashmir isolates them even further. And there's just no question of even the media as an industry, um, media bodies as industry bodies, to take up an issue like advertising. They just don't. Now in the, I'm giving you I'm sort of deviating a little, but just to make my point, during this COVID lockdown, the media, the industry bodies that represent the media, the Indian newspaper federation and all these bodies came out with some sort of data which said that about 1800 crores to some astronomical sum was being denied to them in terms of payment for advertising which the government had placed in the media, and there's no talk of getting that. So the media is continuously dependent on the government, which is why they keep their mouths shut.
In your article in EPW on Kashmir media policy, you state that the Kashmir media policy brings fundamental relationship between the government and the media in Jammu and Kashmir into sharp focus. So, would you like to elaborate on this relationship and how this policy is, um, what this policy suggests about this relationship?
The relationship between the state and the media is a very complex one. The state, the government adopts what it calls a kind of neutral hands off policy when it comes to taking any kind of action against media. And in fact, if you read the media policy that was announced a few months ago, there's a line there which says that the advertising that is being given is not linked to any political consideration of the media house and the political views of the media house. But this is not actually what happens. In reality, the government does make use of advertising, and substantial advertising, to uh, reward the media that is useful and compliant. And this is something that no one really wants to scrutinize sufficiently in terms of the hard data, in terms of the facts. Within the media, nobody talks about it. No one discusses it and speaks of it. Now, this is the overall situation everywhere. Media houses are dependent not just on advertising from the union government, but also from various state governments. In Kashmir, of course, there is no distinction really. After Article 370, the distinction which ought to have existed, the so-called notion of a union territory, whether it's a state or a union territory, it is now managed almost entirely by the union government and its representatives. So the situation in Kashmir changes because of the conflict that also exists, and the fight for independence by the people of Kashmir. So that becomes a very uh, major issue for the government, for any government of that particular, whichever government it is, to manage the narrative and to constantly work with the media and to see that the media helps it in managing this narrative. So the media policy really brings that into sharp focus because it's a hidden, like I said, these are things which are really hidden. They're not discussed openly, they're not scrutinized openly. But by bringing it to the front and by making it so clear, uh, it really sort of sends a message, really, that there is no need to hide anymore. There's no need to disguise it or to pretty it up or to clothe it into something else. It's very clear that government advertising will be given to media houses that are compliant, that serve its purpose, and that further its agenda. It's very, very clear. There's no attempt also to hide it anymore.